This video introduces you to the Hebrew alphabet. The Hebrew alphabet is, of course, the script, that is the writing of the Hebrew language. It is the script of the Jewish Bible, that is the Hebrew Bible, or the original language behind the Christian Old Testament, although, of course, Jews don't call it the Old Testament. The Hebrew Bible, the original language of the Old Testament, was Hebrew, although there are a few places in Daniel and Ezra where the related language Aramaic is found. Aramaic uses the same script as Hebrew does. In fact, the Hebrew language borrowed the Aramaic block script at one point in its history, a little before Christ. It had another script before that you find occasionally, especially with the name of God, in some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which date to the time before Christ. The Hebrew language is therefore the language of the Old Testament. The first letter of the Hebrew language is Aleph. Aleph is not the letter A. In fact, it is hard to pronounce. It's actually a constriction of the throat that you only notice when you say a vowel that comes after it. So the name for God, or the generic name for God, or a word for God, is Elohim, and it begins with an aleph. And so, if we were to do it right, we might slightly constrict our throat when we say it. Elohim, just a little kind of glottal stop, it's called, where you kind of constrict your throat a little before you say the eh in Elohim. So there's no letter in English like this, and it's transliterated with an apostrophe. Transliteration is where you take some other script that's not like English and you put it into English script. And so when you are taking the Hebrew letter Aleph and putting it into English lettering, or this kind of common lettering in the Western world, not just English but other languages, French, German use it too. When you bring it in, transliterate it, write it in English letters, we use a apostrophe to do it. One of the first things you'll realize when you learn an alphabet like Hebrew is that other languages don't do things the way that English does. Other languages have letters we don't have. Sometimes we have letters other languages do. Like, for example, Hebrew doesn't have a letter J. It doesn't have a J sound like English does. So going from one language to another isn't simply finding the Hebrew letters that correspond to the English words. Most of you probably know that. But I did know a freshman in college once who unfortunately somehow got a hold of a Hebrew keyboard, and he typed English where he knew the English letters were on the Hebrew keyboard, and then got a tattoo of some English phrase on his arm. And when he showed it to a Jew who spoke Hebrew a couple weeks later and asked him what he thought it said, he said it was gibberish. It didn't say anything at all, and now he's stuck for life with completely meaningless letters on his arm. In fact, Hebrew goes from right to left. From an English perspective, we would say they write their letters backwards, but of course, from a Hebrew perspective, they write it the right way, and we write our letters backwards. And so it's a brave new world when learning a new language. In Hebrew, learning Hebrew, one of the biggest barriers to learning Hebrew is learning this different script, this different way of writing. You'll see that the Hebrew letter Aleph looks a little bit like an X. In fact, I've known some students to simply write their Aleph with an X, with a capital X, and that's fine. You may find as you look at various scripts of Hebrew, you may find some variation between them. Get ready for it. When you're going from one language to another, you're not going to always have the same transliteration even. Although the transliteration I'm giving you in this video is somewhat standardized. But I remember when I was growing up, Psalm 119 is an acrostic psalm. What that means is each paragraph of Psalm 119 begins with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and all the verses in each section begin with that same letter. So the first section of Psalm 119, all the verses in that section all begin with the letter Aleph. And so it goes Aleph, Beit, Gimel. But one of the things you might notice if you go from one version to the other is that sometimes if they have the letter as a heading for each paragraph, sometimes they spell the letters differently. And so you just have to get used to that there is going to be some variety in the way Hebrew letters are written, depending on what you're looking at, and also in the way they are transliterated, although in this video I'm giving you a somewhat standard transliteration. So Aleph is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and there's no English letter like it. Beit is the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet. You notice it doesn't go A-B. Aleph is not an A. The Hebrew language largely only writes what are called consonants. A in English is a vowel, and Hebrew doesn't have a letter for A. Rather, Jews today and ancient Hebrews, they just kind of knew what vowel went with the consonants. It'd be like if we were to take all the A, E, I, O, and U out of an English newspaper, and we were to try to figure out what it was saying without the vowels. That's the way the Hebrew alphabet is and the way it works. And so Aleph is not A. Beit, however, is like B, and it's written like a, you see here, you would start at the top and do the curve down, and then you would pick up your pen and you would write the line at the bottom, and that's a beit. That little in the bottom right hand, that little hanging over part, is important. One of the things about the Hebrew language is that a lot of the letters kind of look the same, and so those little, we might call them tittles. You might have heard of a jot and a tittle in Matthew 5. That little bit hanging out at the bottom right distinguishes the beit from another letter, and so it's important. Certain parts are important to get. Other parts you can be sloppier on. So Aleph, Beit. Beit is the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and it's transliterated with a B. Gimel. Now, notice that Hebrew in effect goes a letter we don't have, B, and then G. Again, welcome to the brave new world of another language. You might say, well, what happened to the D? Or what happened to the E? Or what happened to the F? Well, there is a D, but it comes later. And there is an F, but it comes later. And of course, there's no E, because as we said, Hebrew doesn't really write the vowels. It doesn't have letters for the vowels. More about that in the next video. Gimel is a hard G sound. That is, it's pronounced G. It's never pronounced J, as in the word, say, gist. That's not the way the Gimel is pronounced. How do you write it? I start at the top and make the line, and then draw the little boot, or the little foot, the other leg, as you would, sticking out. I write the line down, pick up my pen, go up, and then draw the little foot sticking out is how I do it. So Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet. Dalet is the D. Don't ask me why the D comes after the G. When you're learning another language, it is very important not to expect to know the answers to all those things. Now, I'm sure there are answers, and you're welcome to find them, but they're completely irrelevant to learning the language. Dalet is a D. It is pronounced D, so that's nice. The way you write it, the way I write it, is you write the line across at the top, pick up your pen, and then write the line down. And so that's the D. Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet. Hey. Hey is the H, and it's pronounced H, like in English. And you're going to write it by starting at the top, go over and down, pick up your pen, go back, and draw the other little bit there. You'll notice that it's kind of like a Dalet with a line under the top part. Although the Dalet has a little tittle that hangs to the right at the top a little bit over the line. This one you can just do in one continuous writing, top, over, and down, and not worry about picking up your pen there. So Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav. Vav is often written as just an up and down line. Now you will find some books that will call it wow, W-A-W, and will translate it with a W. You do find that. That is not uncommon at all. However, I'm following the pronunciation of modern Hebrew here. Why not be able to piggyback on the learning of ancient Hebrew, a little bit of modern Hebrew? Now originally it may have been pronounced a little bit more like a W, but I'm going to give you the modern Hebrew pronunciation of the letters, and so I'm going to call it a Vav, and I'm going to transliterate it with a V instead of a W. Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin. Again, why are they giving you the Z this early in the letters? Ours is not to question why. Ours is just to memorize or die. Zayin is transliterated with a Z, and the way I write it is I do that little diagonal at the top, pick up my pen, and then do the line down. Zayin, Z. Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin. Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin. And then Chet. Chet. This is a letter we don't have in English. It is not just it's not a K, it's not a K, it's a Ch. It's like the Scottish lach, lach, or ich in German. It's a throat, a little bit of a guttural H, a little hard kind of K sound. It'd be the original chi in Greek, although most people don't pronounce it that way. You notice it looks an awful lot like the hey we just had. The difference is, and I would write it by starting at the top, left, coming over and down, pick up my pen, and then write the next line. The difference between the chet and the hey is that the hey doesn't connect at the top, whereas the chet does connect at the top. And so it's often transliterated as an H with a dot under it. Again, we don't have a letter like this in English, and so it's a different kind of letter. Hebrew loves the gutturals, the kind of stuff. Actually, Arabic's even worse. Arabic's related to Hebrew, ironically perhaps. But so this is chet. The next is tate. Now tate is not just a T. It's an explosive T. T. In fact, you might have heard someone speaking Indian, and I mean the real India over in India. Sometimes they talk like this. Talk. It's a kind of an explosive T where you might put your tongue on the front of your roof of your mouth and explode like that. Tate is written by starting up at the far left and then kind of doing like you're doing a U, but then curl back down into the middle, and that's a tate. So chet, tate, and then yod. Yod is the jot of Matthew 5, not one jot or tittle. The yod is sometimes unnecessary. In an instant I'll talk about in the next video. That's where the idea of a jot or a tittle, little things that aren't as significant. But the yod is transliterated as a Y. This is the first letter of God's name, His proper name, Yahweh. Begins with a yod. Since the Germans did a lot of this early language work, they transliterated it with a J, which is where we get the idea of Jehovah. At some point perhaps I'll talk about how Jehovah is kind of a strange word that takes two different words and blends them together. But the reason why the Germans started with the J is because in German the J is pronounced like a Y. That's not really important for English speakers to know, but this is the yod, the Y, and it is kind of like an apostrophe in Hebrew, and it transliterates as a Y and is pronounced like a Y. So the letters we have so far are Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tate, Yod. Okay? Kaf. Kaf is a K. And it looks a little like a bait, except it doesn't hang, you don't have a tittle on the bottom that hangs over to the right. It's just one continuous move. Start at the top, come over, down, and back over, and you have the cough. It's a K. Now, why do I have a second cough there at the bottom? Because Hebrew does something that is a little challenging to English speakers, but believe me, it's better than Aramaic, and I mean better than Arabic, and way better than Ethiopic. There are 5 letters, I believe it's 5, in the Hebrew alphabet that have a different form of the letter when it's the last letter of a word than if it's in the middle or at the beginning. So the letter Kaf, when it's at the beginning or middle of a word, is going to look like the top Kaf. But when it's the last letter of a word, then it's almost like you grab that bottom line and pulled it down. So the way you write a final Kaf is you do the line across the top, and then you go down, but you keep going down beyond the line. This would be, it'd look like a dalet, a D, if you stopped at the bottom of the line and didn't keep going down. You have to go down below the line, below other letters. Other letters don't go down as far as this final Kaf when you write it. So when a Kaf is at the end of a word, you're going to write it a little bit differently. We'll find several letters like this, and it's almost like you grabbed the bottom part of the normal Kaf and pulled it down, if you want to think of it that way. So certain Hebrew letters look differently at the end of the word than they do at the beginning or middle of the word. So, Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Ket, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed. This is the L. Lamed is transliterated with an L. The thing that's a little peculiar about this is that this is the only letter that goes above the line. So if you were writing this next to other Hebrew letters, see the horizontal flat piece? That would be level with the other letters, but you would have this part of the lamed, like a camel sticking its head up, that goes above the line. So when you're writing a lamed, you're going to start above the line, you're going to come down a little. When you get the top of the other letters, you're going to come over horizontally, and then you're going to bring it on down with a little bit of a curve. So that's the lamed, the L. Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Ket, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem. Mem is the M, and it's going to be transliterated with an M, and it's going to be pronounced like an M. This letter does have a different final form than at the beginning and middle. To write the normal one, I usually start at the bottom left, and I go up and around like I'm drawing a little house, and then I go back up and put on the little line there at the top. That's how I write the normal mem. The final mem is a bit like a square, and you can write it like a square. I start there at the top left to write it, go horizontal, and I go straight down, and I go straight back over and straight up, and you've written a final mem, which is the M at the end of a word. Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Ket, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun. Nun is the N, and it's transliterated with an N. To write the normal Nun, I start just a little bit over to the left, come over just a little bit, down, and then back over just a little bit. Important not to confuse this with the Vav, because the Vav comes straight down too. The key in not confusing it with the Vav is to be sure to go back over to the left a little at the bottom. So I've known people who write their Nun by coming straight down like the Vav and then just going just a teeny bit over at the bottom. The final Nun is again different, and again it's like you grabbed that bottom part and pulled it down. Final Nun goes below the line, just like the final Kaf does. And so you're going to start at the top and come over a little bit and straight down, but you're going to keep going down below where the other letters, you're going to come down below the bottom of the other letters for the final Nun. Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Ket, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samekh. Samekh is the normal S. It's probably not the most frequently used S in Hebrew, but it is the Hebrew S, and you transliterate it with an S. It's like a circle. So I start at the top left and then kind of draw a circle and come back up like an apple, but I come back up just a little bit to the right of where I started. Don't confuse it with a final mem, which is more like a square, remember, the final mem, the final M. So this is more like a circle. So, Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin, Ket, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samekh, Ayin. Ayin is probably the most bizarre letter for us from a speaking standpoint. There's no letter like this. It's very similar to the Aleph, but it's even more of a stop. I had a professor who once described it as the sound of incipient vomiting. So, kind of remember when you're beginning to heave, you're about to throw up, you know, that kind of a Ayin kind of a sound. Most people just ignore it when they're pronouncing Hebrew. But it's a backwards apostrophe, or a single quotation mark at the beginning. That's how it's translated. And it's written, basically the way I write it is I draw a line down, and then I come over a little, pick up my pen, come over a little to the right, and draw a curve that connects with the line down. And so that's the letter Ayin. So we have Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin, Ket, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samekh, Ayin, Pei. Pei is the letter P, and it's transliterated with a P, and it's pronounced P. The way I write it is I start with the little curly hanging down. I usually start and then curve up and around. So I don't do the little hat or flick at the top left. I start in the middle and then round it around. So like I'm almost drawing a spiral is how I write it. And then the final Pei has a different form when it's at the last letter. Again, it's like you grab that bottom line and pulled it down below the line. And so to write it, I start like I'm going to do a normal Pei, and I swirl up, and then instead of curling around, I just go straight down below where the other letters end. So Pei is one of those letters, again, that comes down below the line, so to speak. Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin, Ket, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samekh, Ayin, Pei, Tzadeh. Tzadeh is a letter that we don't have in English. It's transliterated with an S with a dot under it. It's like a TS sound, Tzadeh. And the way I write it is I start at the top left, and I draw a diagonal, and then I go back to the left at the bottom, like almost like I'm drawing a triangle, but I don't do the third side. So I do that angle, and then I pick my pen up and I go halfway in the diagonal and write the little part that goes up. So that's the way I write a tzadeh. A final tzadeh, again, it's like you pulled that bottom line down. The way I write it is I draw a line from top to bottom, but I draw the line coming down below the bottom of the other letters, so it goes down below the line. A straight line is how I do it, and then I go back up, pick up my pen, go back up to the right, and draw a diagonal that comes down and meets it a little above halfway. So that's the tzadeh, the TS sound, ts. So Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin, Ket, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samekh, Ayin, Pei, Tzadeh, Kof. Kof is transliterated with a Q. It's probably pronounced with your tongue a little bit against your palate. Kof, kof, kof. So it's not a K. It's a kof kind of a sound. And the way you write it is by drawing that line down, and then going back up and to the top left and coming back around. So that's how you write a kof. I believe that the kof is that line on the left comes down a little bit below the line when you write it, and then you come back up and around. Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Ket, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samekh, Ayin, Pei, Tzadeh, Kof, Resh, Resh. This is the R, and it's transliterated with an R. And the way you write it, again, is you start at the top left, and in one continuous movement come over horizontally and then down without lifting up the pen. And this is the R. I suppose the Hebrews would pronounce it not so much like we would in English pronounce an R, but more of a little bit more of a guttural R, a little bit more like maybe a German R, resh, if you really want to be authentic. Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Ket, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samekh, Ayin, Pei, Tzadeh, Kof, Resh, Sin. Sin is a S, and it's transliterated as an S with a line. To be honest, I'm not sure that this is pronounced that much different from a Samekh. I don't pronounce it myself differently from a Samekh. You write it like a pitchfork, so I usually start on the top left and come back around like I'm doing a U, and then come up and draw the line down in the middle. And then the dot on the left side tells you it's a seen instead of a sheen. Seen, sheen, the next letter. Again, Hebrew, probably at the time of Christ, did not put the dots there. The dots are there to help us non-Hebrew speakers to know whether to pronounce it as s or sh. The sheen is more common. So some, I think in Psalm 119, this is actually one letter, one paragraph. It's not distinguished as a different letter in Psalm 119, I don't think, in the acrostic. Lamentations is also an acrostic. Each chapter is an acrostic. In the middle chapter, chapter 3, I think, actually goes through the alphabet 3 times, if I remember correctly. Seen, sheen. Sheen is transliterated as an S with a little hat on the top there, or upside down hat, if you would, a V, little V on the top, and it's pronounced like an SH, sh. And you write it the same way as the seen. You start on the top left, curve around like a U, go lift your pen up, draw the middle prong up from the top to the bottom, I do, and then but the dot on this one goes on the far right one. And this one's a little more common, I think, a more common letter than the seen. And so we are ready for the final letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Ket, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samekh, Ayin, Pei, Tzadeh, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, Tav. So Tav, or in older Hebrew grammars they might have said Tau, T-A-W, but going with modern Hebrew pronunciation, I'm going to say Tav. It is transliterated with the normal T. The way I write it is I start off writing a resh, is top left and down, but then pick the pen up and go back and write the final thing going down. Now, you don't want to confuse this with a chet, which just comes straight down, and so you need to have that little foot at the bottom of the left stroke. You need to come down and then go out a little to the left so that you can distinguish this from a chet. So that's the final letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Tav. Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Ket, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samekh, Ayin, Pei, Tzadeh, Kof, Resh, Shin, Sin, Shin, Tav. Sorry, I messed up there. A couple other things before we leave you on this alphabet video. First, I wanted to talk about a dot that can appear in certain letters. So, for example, if a word begins with Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Kaf, Pei, or Tav, these are called the Bagad Kafat letters, where we've just taken those letters and stuck vowels in between. These letters can have a slightly different pronunciation depending on whether they have that dot. See the bait there with the dot in the middle? That dot is called a dagesh. And depending on whether or not the dot is there, you're either going to pronounce it one way or another. Now, to be honest, I don't pronounce, and modern Hebrew I don't think pronounces the gimel, the dalet, the kaf, or the tav. Modern Hebrew I don't think pronounces those letters differently, whether they have the dot or not. So go ahead and always pronounce the gimel g. Go ahead and always pronounce the dalet d. Go ahead and always pronounce the kaf as kaf, k. Go ahead and always pronounce the tav as t. Older grammars did pronounce them differently. So they pronounced the dalet the when it didn't have the dot, and only d when it did have the dot. Or they pronounced the tav th when it didn't have the dot, and t when it did have the dot. But by and large, people don't, modern Hebrew doesn't pronounce it that way. And so the two where modern Hebrew does pronounce them differently is the bait. When the dot is there, modern Hebrew pronounces the bait as b. But when the dot is not there, modern Hebrew pronounces the bait as v, like a v. Similarly for the p, or pay, modern Hebrew, when the dot is there, pronounces the pay as p. But when the dot is not there, then modern Hebrew pronounces the p as f. Now sometimes in transliteration, if you really want to be technical, a transliteration will put a line under the b, under the d, under the kaf, under the pay, under the tav. If the dot is not there, over the G is where it's usually put rather than under, and over the P, but under the B, under the D, under the K, and under the T, a line. A lot of some Hebrew transliterations will put a line under or over the transliterated letter if the dagesh is not there, just to give you a hint that it's not there, and to give you some sense of how to pronounce it. So if you saw a transliteration of a B with a line under it, you would pronounce it as a V. Similarly, if you had a pay with a line over it, a P with a line over it, then you would pronounce it F instead of P in pronunciation. So that's to explain what that line under certain of these letters is. If the dot is there, it's a hardened sound, B or P. If the dot is not there, then it's V or F. This is just a pronunciation issue. It's not going to change your interpretation or anything, probably. Where do these letters have that dot, that dagesh? Well, when a letter of this sort begins a syllable, then it's going to be a hardening dagesh. And so, in other words, there would be another letter right before it that would finish, or either at the beginning of a syllable, and the way you would tell a syllable was beginning would be that if there was a letter right before it without a vowel in between, then that would tell you that it was at the beginning of a syllable. These things take a little getting used to. They're not really that important for interpretation most of the time. The hardening dagesh doesn't really change the interpretation. However, there is a doubling dagesh. In certain instances, that dot tells you that the letter is doubled. So a B would go to a BB. And that can change the meaning. So like a gimel with a doubling dagesh means that you're transliterating two G's instead of just one G. And with the bagad kafat letters, it's, it can be a bit of a learning curve to figure out when it's a doubling dagesh and when it's simply a hardening dagesh that's making the sound change. Well, these doubling dageshes can be used on any letter. And of course, if the dot is on a letter that isn't a bagad kafat letter, that is, if you have a dot on a mem, you know it's a doubling dagesh. If you have a dot in the middle of a lamed, then you know it's a doubling dagesh. And so, if the dagesh appears in any letter other than the bagad kafat letters, you know it's a doubling dagesh. However, there are some places where the bagad kafat dot is not a hardening dagesh, but it's a doubling dagesh. And so if you have a doubling, if you have a Bagad Kafat letter that is both ending a syllable and beginning a new syllable, then you know it's a doubling dagesh. This is particularly the case in the middle of a word. A beginning letter never doubles. That is, at the beginning of a word, there's never an instance in a Hebrew word where a dot in the first letter of a word is a doubling dagesh. That just doesn't happen. And so a Bagad Kafat letter at the beginning of a word with a dot in it, you know is not a doubling dagesh. But a Bagad Kafat letter in the middle of a word, you're going to have to decide whether that B, G, D, K, P, T, you have to decide whether it's beginning a syllable, in which case it's simply a hardening of the sound, or whether it is finishing a syllable and beginning a new syllable, the doubling situation. That takes some skill, but you can get used to it with practice. And of course, if you don't get used to it, the tools will, if you have a tool that tells you the transliteration, it's going to tell you that it's a doubling dagesh because it'll have two of the same letter there. This has been the Hebrew alphabet. I want to end by going through the letters again in the song. So here we go, the Hebrew alphabet one more time. Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Kate, Tate, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samekh, Ayin, Pei, Tzadeh, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, Tav.